Hi everyone, welcome to this quick tutorial on data modeling and how that can be implemented using Power BI. Now, when we talk about data modeling, one of the things which we are importantly talking about is the relationships. Now, when you talk about your relational database world, in simple terms, what we can understand is that you normally, when you talk about data modeling, you have a facts table and you have a dimension table. So let's quickly understand what you mean by your fact table, or what we talk about table which has measures or which can be your calculated values. And then you also have your dimension tables which are holding your data. So for example, you have a dimension table. Now we can understand that with simple examples. So this dimension table might have, say, 5 columns. Let's take a simple example. So let's say we have a customer ID, we have the name, we have the location of the customer, what products the customer bought, and the country of the customer. So here you can say the customer ID, that would be the primary key column, which is basically uniquely identifies the data here. And this is what I'm talking about as a dimension table. Now I can have then specific data for product table. So that would basically have more information or specific information about different products. So here we have the products which are in the customer table, which basically talks about what are the products the customer bought. And here I can basically have a product ID. So that's the primary key column for this table. And then you have your product description, which is basically the product name. And then you can say the product quality, high quality, low quality, and probably the price of the product. So this is one more dimension table. Now you could have another dimension tables which could have a link to this table. So when we talk about your schema, and if we want to understand data modeling, so there is what we call as your snowflake schema and your star schema. So when I say star schema, in simple words, it could be understood that you could have multiple dimension tables in this way. And then you have a facts table which basically has information. So I could say there is a customer ID here, you have your product ID here, might be you have something else which talks about location ID. If you have a specific table for the location which is based on country, so you have location ID and then the country name. If that's one table, so you have location ID. And then you can have some measures or columns which are nothing but calculated values. So when I say calculated values, might be it is quantity, might be it is tax amount, and so on. So you have basically relationships. So this is your primary key, and you have one relationship here. You have product ID, you have one relationship here, you have location ID, you have one relationship here, and probably this one also relates to a particular column which has a relation. So this becomes your fact table, and these are your dimension tables. And that's what we mean by your star schema in simple terms, where you have a direct relationship between the dimension tables, which basically contain the data, and your facts table, which contains the measures. Now dimension data can have a lot of values which could be unique or could be duplicates. Now that could again have your facts table could have repeated values. So you could have product ID and location ID and same product and location ID, but might be that belongs to a different customer ID, so you can have different entries. So that's your star schema. Now if you talk about the other kind of schema, then that is your snowflake And snowflake basically means that you have another dimension table, but that is not having a direct connection with fact table. So for example, here I'm talking about products, and then this particular product is related to a product subcategory. So might be I have one more column here which talks about subcategory of the products, and here you have the table which has subcategory ID, and then you have basically details of that particular product. Might be it is a luxury product, might be it is a consumer product, or whatever it is. So always when you have the main key, so these becomes your primary key, and here you are talking about your foreign key concept. Or say for example, you have these as your foreign keys because this one, or your product ID, is basically your primary key. So you could have these columns which can be taken. So if you have, in simple terms, either you have a star schema or you have a snowflake schema, wherein your dimension tables are then connected to other dimension tables, but some dimension tables have no connection between fact and dimension. So if you are pulling out information which is about a product and a subcategory of that, then you would have to connect your fact table with dimension table. So this is, in short, brief about your data modeling, which we need to understand when we are defining relationships. Now we can have our data sets which can be coming in from different sources. We may want to connect them so that we can access the data from both of them, and then we can basically have a consolidated information. So what we can do here is, let's look at an example. So other than our regular data, let's load some interesting data. Now here I have a scenario where I was using a different tool, but then we are investigating, or we are doing some threat hunting. Now you have the data which comes in from different sources. So let me just show you that. So for example, if I look into the data here, and this data set, or these set of data sets, I'll show you the GitHub link from where you can download all this data set. You have to just go ahead and type, say, bot sv1 data set, and you have basically the full data set which can be downloaded, which is huge, or you have the attack only data set. Now this has basically your Windows event logs, it has firewall related events, it has DNS or HTTP, and you have other data here. So this data can also be used to basically join your different data sets and create a relationship, because what we know is the data might be coming in from different sources, but then it has certain fields which have a connectivity between them. So we can use one such data set or couple of data sets. So if you would want to download this, you can directly download these attack only data sets, or what you can do is, all these source files are available as JSON or also as CSV source type. That's where I got the data from. So you can use this. So for example, if we have the data coming in here, and say I have data coming in from firewall, that is FortiGate, you have data coming in from HTTP stream or HTTP DNS, you have Windows event log, and we can take up these data sets and see how we can basically use them. Now say for example, you are searching for the HTTP data, and then you would want to find out how many source IPs are there, or how many destination IPs are there, and then what kind of information it contains. So let's start with some data set here. So for example, let's say get data. I will use Excel. I will get into the data types. I can choose all files, and let's go for the first one just to play around with this one. Let's see what does this contain. Now this is a huge data set. FortiGate event, that's mainly for firewall related data. So let's open this. Now, obviously, the data is huge. It shows whatever we have based on first 200 rows, which we see there is a serial number, there is a time, source, what is the protocol which was used, what's the source type, you have host, you have index, you have Splunk server, and then you have the raw events, which are all in one column, which obviously we can split and create different columns based on our requirement. So before we do a load of this data, let's go for transformation, which brings our Power Query editor. Now we have the serial number. Are we really interested in this? So I would say probably not. So I will just go ahead and remove this column. So time is fine. You have time, which can be then split as per time zone. You have source type, which we know it is coming from FortiGate event. I can keep that just in case I would later want the information to be understood. I have host, I have index. Now this is where the data is coming from, and I don't need this. So Splunk server, let me get rid of this. And then I have the raw data, which we have seen earlier, but let's go ahead and split this, because if you just double click on one value, it tells me that it talks about the time, it talks about an IP address, it says date, it has a device name, device ID, login ID, type. So it basically gives me subtype, it has user statistics and all this. So let's play around with this one and let's break this or split this. So what I can do here is I can go ahead and select this and I can choose split, and I can go by delimiter. Now delimiter can be chosen, and I see that there is space as a delimiter, and I calculated, if I look at the event, I can divide that into 9 different columns. But rather than going by delimiter, I'll go by positions, and it basically says these are the positions. You can anyways change the number. So it says something at 16th position and then 30th position and so on. So you can do that. You can just say okay. Now what does that do? It has basically replaced my data with different columns. Now that's based on the positions. So then we can basically transform it in a better way. So for example, I have these two which says August and 5th, but let's see if we have any date field here which says it talks about August 5th, it talks about the time. So what I can do is I can actually get rid of this one. So I can say let's choose this, and let's go ahead and remove these columns. So that's gone. So you have time, you have IP addresses, and let's basically look at this. So I have this time, I have the date, and then I have time again. So let's select this and this. And what I have noticed, or I have seen already, that the time what you have here and the time what you see here as the event time is the same. So let me go ahead and remove these columns too. So that's also gone. Now we have the date as the column, so I can remove this one. And what I can do is this one I can rename as date. So let's choose this. Let's give it a name. Let's call it date. And that's your date. Now this one is your time. So let's change this to time. And we can make it time. So that's done. Now here I have the IP address. So for example, let's just rename this and let's call it IP address. So that's also done. Now let's see what else we have. So we have a host IP here, and then we had an IP which shows up. So I do have this, and basically these values should be same. So what I can do is I can in fact get rid of this one also, remove this. So date is fine, time is fine, you have host. Now these are your device names. So let's basically give a name to this column. So I can say rename, I will call it device name, and that's fine. What we will also do is it will be easier to check, so we can replace this. So I can say replace values, and let's give this pattern. So I'll say device name equals, and I want to just remove that. So let's say okay, and your device name is gone. Similarly, you have device ID. Let's do the same thing. So first let's rename it to device ID. So that's my device ID. And here I will replace this. So I will say replace values. And let's say device ID equals has to be replaced or should be gone. So that's also done. Now you have your login ID. So let's get rid of this column. So I will remove this, and then here I have, I think it should be log ID or login ID. So let's rename this and let's call it log ID. So that's also done. Now we can change this data types. So we have some raw event here which says type is event, subtype is system. So we can split this again. So let's take this, let's do a split, and let's call it by, say, delimiter. So I can basically split it with delimiter, and that's going to create 4 columns if we use equals. Or I can go for position. For example, let's go in here and let's try doing a split, and this time let's go for position, and here it gives me some positions. So let's say okay. So it's giving me some error, please enter a value. So let's say 4, 5, 9, 10. Let's say 10, and let's say 11, and then you have a space. So let me just choose this and check how it works. So you have your subsystem type, which is fine, but then I lose my event. So I don't want to lose anything. So let me cancel this. Okay. And we have the data here. Let's say type is event, system is subsystem, and I can basically have the information here, but then let's go ahead and ignore this because this one would not be really used in my search. So I can in fact remove this, or I could have said type and it will have event, subtype will be system, but that's going to remain same. So let me remove this column. Now again I have raw format which talks about level, what kind of information it is it information, is it notice, you have root ID, you have log description, you have interface. So let's go ahead and split this one. So let's do a split. Let's go by positions, and we have the positions here. So let's, for example, take position of the characters here. So for example, the first one could be you have 5 and 6, 18. So let's say 18, and then let's go for other values. So that's again your, let's go for say 28, and then we have 28 and 7, 35, 36, 36 and 5, 41, 42, and you have 4, 46, around 52. So let's go for 52. So what I did was the last column which we had, which we were splitting by position. So we can basically split based on positions or the number of characters, but then sometimes in one bit of information you might have indefinite number of characters. So choosing the splitting based on characters or positions might be inappropriate. What we can do is we can do a splitting, and I can go for delimiter, and this time in custom I will, instead of custom, I'll go for space, which should basically consider every space as the delimiter. It automatically identifies the maximum number of columns which will be created is 13. We can anyways get rid or delete some of those which we don't need. So let's say okay, and it has done the splitting. So now you have all this as level. So let me rename this. So you have to work with transforming your data before that can be loaded in the way you want. So let this be level, and let's also replace this like we did earlier with level equals, and then replace it. So that becomes your information or notice. Now this is your VD, which is related to your login. So for example, let's keep this. So I will rename this to VD, and then we can basically replace all the values here. So let's call it VD equals, and then replace it with nothing. So that gives me the root user. I also have the description here, which tells me where is this information coming from. So let's rename this to log description. And then once that is done, we will also replace the values. So I'll say replace, and I will go for log description equals replaced with nothing. So that gives me log description. Here we have interface or action. So this is what we have, which basically has some values. Now if I go into the filter, it tells me, it talks about the count, or it talks about the interface, or it talks about status. So there are various fields. Now we could keep it as it is, and we know that there is this delimiter, so let's just call it type, and that's enough. So now you have the total, which talks about the count or CPU. So we have messages, right? How many times it was used, what kind of statistics it is, right? And we have a lot of information here which we can use, and we can filter this, but it depends on what kind of information I'm looking from this particular data set. I'm really going for something like totaling or something like CPU count. So you always have these filters which tells me, okay, if you're looking for what kind of messages you have, what kind of information you have. So let us have that as it is. This one talks about your action, or it talks about your message, and so on. So I would not need this. So let me remove this one. Then I have message, which talks about statistics. It talks about total sessions. So either I can focus on the message, or I can look at how many sessions were there. So that's something which we can look at, and we can do a filter. So for example, I can say text filters, and let's say begins with, and let's say either you have message begins with, we can choose one of these. So either I could say total session, or I could keep message, or I could keep IPs. So I can have specific kind of data. So let's say, yeah, so let's do one thing. First we will do some filtering here. So first I will say replace the values, and I can basically keep it as message, total sessions, and IP address. These are the three things I would be interested in, and rest of the things can be taken off. So what I will do is here I will say unselect all. Then I will go for action is login, action is logout. I can look for the IP values. I can look at message values, and then you have your total sessions. So if you are really looking for a count of total sessions, or we could have split this data, filtered it out, and created different columns out of it. So let's go for, because message we already have, so let's go for total sessions. So here I will basically say I'm only interested in begins with, and let's say total session, and I will just say I'm interested in total session values. Let's filter it, so that gives me total sessions. And if you see here, it might affect the kind of information what you are collecting if you are using this particular filter. So let's keep it dynamic. Let's clear the filter. Now I do have information about your disk, your bandwidth, not interested, your setup rate. So let's take this, let's take this, let's take this, let's take disk log rate. I will remove these columns. Then I have my other information, message performance statistics, not interested, remove these columns. So I have my list of columns. Now we do see that the user is root here in most cases. So VD, and what we can do is we can remove this, because if it's all column values or common values, we don't need it. Log ID, it's not relevant. And I have filtered out my data, which has date, which has time, device name, device ID, IP address, what is the source type. So this is, we will keep this, which can be useful. And now we have our timestamp here, which basically has the data, but we have date and time, which is given here. So we can either keep one of these, or I can keep the time column, so that I can sort it out based on time or based it on dates. So let's choose this and this, which is 6:28. This is in a different time zone, so let me get rid of this one. So I'll say remove. Now that's basically the data which I have. Looks good, which we can use. So I will say close and apply, and that's applying my changes. Now this is one simple data set which we took from firewall, and which has particular fields. So you see there is a date field. Now date field is basically, you can look at the date hierarchy. You have year, quarter, month, day, and you can choose, work on it. So you have some raw fields, and we can rename those. So we will see that. So we have data which is getting loaded, and that's your CPU which we had. We have the total sessions which we are seeing here. Okay, and we have some systematic information. Let's also go back here, home, and what I can do is I can go into transform, just a quick run through the data. So we have the IPs, host, log description. Now these are my raw fields which talk about the type, which talk about the total, and which talk about the messages. So let's give them some name rather than keeping, so we can call them, this is type. Let's rename this and let's call it type 1 info. Let's call this one type 2 info. And then let's call this one type 3 info. Did I? Oh, I removed the column, sorry. Yeah, so type 2 info, and then you have type 3 info. Type 3 info. And so you see we had some raw data or data coming in from logs, but we have transformed it. Let me just do a close and apply. And that's my one data set which we have, which will have these fields. If you see the names, right? And it shows me the kind of information we have. Now, depending on the filters, so you have these different filters. I can select all, and it shows me all the information. I can unselect these, and I can say, okay, I'm interested in looking at the information where IP is 250, and let's select that. And basically then it gives me the kind of log description messages, what is the type of info. And again, in this I have just interface information. In this I'm seeing DHCP message, right? So I can remove the filter, but then my filter works perfectly fine. So this is the data I have, and we are good to go with this one. So I can basically save this if this is what I'm interested in. Let's call it something. So let's say FortiGate event report, save it. And that's basically the report which I have saved with this information, although we have not done any kind of visualization on this. So this is good. Now let's take a stream HTTP data and work on it. And we can see how we can connect these. So for example, let's go in here. So let's select all files. So we took this data. Now we have a traffic data. It would be interesting if you would want to look at the data before, because then you would know what data can be collected. So if we look at this data, which is in a CSV format, looking in Excel, so it's trying to read that. And then we will see what are the fields which we can use to map different information. So you might have some firewall information about an IP, you might have the traffic information, you might have the DNS information, you might have the attack or the malware information, and all that information can be joined together by we creating a model which can have a relationships, and then basically create visualization which relates to the data coming in from different data sets. So you could do a join, you can have multiple data sets, and you can go for a left join, right join, you can merge different data sets, you can do that. But data modeling does make your work easier, where you can have your facts and dimension tables, you can basically have more meaning to it. So it says file not loaded completely, that's okay, we will filter this. Now if you see here, this also has a host information, it has time, and it basically talks about server, and then you have your raw data, which basically is your timestamp, device ID, what we were seeing, and then you have your login ID like we had in previous example, right? And then this is basically the traffic information. So if I basically take one such field here, I could see what is the kind of information it contains. It gives me the traffic information, what is the source protocol, right? So this is my one event which I'm looking at. It tells me what was the transaction IP, what was the transport port, what was the service which was used, is what it was a Microsoft portal which was being used, what was the application risk, what was detected, how many bytes were sent, how many bytes were received, right? So this is basically giving me some traffic information. Now we might be able to use this if I really want to see from one particular source IP. If you look at the source IP here and to the destination IP, how many bytes or how many packets were sent, and that might be something which we want to query or visualize and find out if there is basically huge amount of data flowing out or flowing in. So we can take this data. So looks interesting, so let's not save it, and I will go ahead here, and what I will do is, this is my one data set. So let's go in home, let's go to get data, Excel, let's go in here, I'm looking at all files, look at the traffic data, open. Obviously that's huge data, so we want to transform this. We can even limit the number of rows or select particular IPs which we would want to look at. So as we did last time, let's remove the serial number, not needed. Time, we will have in other fields, so let's get rid of that. Source is fine, source type is fine, host is fine, index not needed, your server not needed. You have the raw data which has to be basically split, and this is the data which we have. Now we can select certain important fields here, so let's go ahead and do a split, and let's go for positions. And if you see, it identifies the position, it basically knows that there are these positions, the values are at these positions, which we can then merge. Or say for example, I could have gone simply by space. So if I say let's go in by split columns, by delimiter, let's choose space as the delimiter, let's say okay, and that basically gives me columns. So let's go in for this one, August, this one. So we will see if we have any time field. So we don't have any time field as of now. This is what we have. We have date, we have time, which can be merged together if we are interested in. So what I can do is I can remove these columns, right? So it becomes so easy with Power BI, where you're working with bigger data sets, although the data is in structured format. But even if it is not, you can use all these things to basically split the data. Now here we have some timing, so let's get rid of this one. Let's remove this one. So there is repeated information. You have host and this one. Let's remove this, because all the information in a raw format is stored in one particular column. So you have date and time. So we can keep the date and time together. We can concatenate it. We can basically merge it and make it one. So let's say first, let me replace this. So I will basically go ahead and rename, or let's say replace, and I'm going to replace all the date equals with nothing. So that purely gives me the date, and this one is time. So let's replace everything with time. So time equals, and then replace it with nothing, and then I choose this, and I do a merge, and let's call it separator. Let it be, I can give a colon, or I can give a comma, or I can give a space. Space looks good. Let's call it date and time, or let's just say date. So that's my data, looks good. So you have device name, you have your device ID like what we had. So we don't need this one, which we deleted. So let's get rid of that. So type, you can always see how many values you have. So if it is type is traffic, let it be. So let's quickly replace this one with device name, and then basically go ahead and, oh, I did a remove, but not to worry. I can just cancel this and I have it back. So now I can replace the values here, and let's say device name is replaced with just the name. Similarly, this is device ID. So let's do that device ID, and we will still do a replacing here. So I will say replace all the values, and device ID equals is replaced with the actual value. Type is traffic, let that be. It's a type of information which might be useful for us. So let's go ahead and rename this, and let's call it type 1 info. And here I will replace all the values of type equals. There should be multiple other simpler ways of doing it. You can transform the data using a programming language. You can do that. So this tells me there are some subtypes which are about, because we are talking about the traffic data, so it says subtype, which is forward or local. Now that depends on what kind of information you're searching for, but let's keep this. So I will rename this, I will call it subtype. Might be we can take this and keep it in a different column or different table altogether, so we can do that. So subtype, and let's say replace the values here. Subtype equals is replaced with just the value. Then you have the level. You can see what kind of levels you have. It just says notice. That's the only one value. So let's get rid of this one. Let's get rid of this one. Now you have the source IP. You have the source port, which can be very useful information. So let's rename this, and let's call it source IP. Go ahead and replace the values here. So let's say replace, and I'm going to say source IP equals is replaced with everything. So that's gone. And now you have your source ports, which could also be important. So let's go ahead and rename this. Let's call it source port, and let's replace the values. Source port equals, and that's basically gone. Now we can go further. We can look at the source and what is this kind of information. So here it tells it's a source, internal source port, what we are seeing, and we have some internal or some other information. So there might be various other messages, but all of these refers to the same key and value. So let's rename this. We'll see how we can use all of this information. So I'll call it int f, and then I'm going to replace this. Source intf equals is replaced because we have given the column name. Now you have the destination IP and destination port, very important information. So let's go ahead and rename this. Let's call it destination IP, which might be just meaning IP in some other data set. So let's do a destination IP. Let's replace the values now with DST IP equals is gone. And the same thing here, DST port, that's the name, and then replace. I could have done that easily in Excel also, but then it's good to view the data and then make the changes here. So destination port, and then you have your this one. So it basically has some values. Might be we don't need this, so let me remove this column, and I will remove this column also. I don't need it. So till I have my source IPs and port, destination IP and port, which we can even merge with a particular column. But let's keep it separate in case we would want to pull out the information. Then you have your raw information which says session IDs and all that. So let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. And anytime you can basically see what kind of information it has. So it has some session IDs. We are looking at the bytes going in and out. So let's remove these columns. That's gone. You have policy ID, okay, and action. So let's keep these. So this one basically has either your policy ID or destination country information. And what has happened is based on the position, sometimes you see the destination ID or country either in this field or in this field, right? So you have destination country, source country, destination country, and source country. So this information, what we are seeing here, is something which has split based on the positions what we have. So we have position ID which has action. So let's look at these. So we have, so we have action, we have policy ID, destination country, source country, and then you have these fields. So what we will have to do is if we have to extract the values and create this as a new column. So for example, I had this and I could basically say duplicate columns, and then I can basically say one can just have my policy ID values, one can have my destination ID values. So it depends on the kind of information we are looking at. We don't want to lose any particular data here, but let's see. So we have action. Let me do one thing. Let's say action. Let's say raw 2324, destination, source country. So you have a service which tells you about what kind of service was used, what was the duration. You have to just make sure that you don't have any fields which are being missed because of the data what we have. So, well, we have the actions, policy ID, destination country, source country, what kind of transport was used, what kind of service was used. And this is where it gets challenging because you have lots and lots of fields. So if you see here, all these fields are nulls. So first, let's take this, let's take this. So you have fields where there might be data down the line. I mean, it does not mean that all these fields. So you see here, there is some data in the underlying rows. But it depends on what is the information we are looking for. So for now, I will just choose this. We can do a lot of work here, but let's not get into everything. Let's do a remove. Let's just see step by step the critical ones. And let's go all the way here. Let's do a remove. We don't need this data. So here we have your application category, your collaboration, your app risk. Now this could be useful. So let's do one thing. Let's keep this, 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 because remember we have a text filter which can be used to filter out the data. So I can basically choose these fields as one, transport. Let's keep this one and we will test it. So we have these fields. Let's take this last one. Yeah, and let's do a merge column. Okay, and I will basically say let the delimiter be either comma, which could be useful. So let's go for comma and let's call this info. So that's my data which has been split. Now say for example, if I would want to filter out some values, I do have something like this and I could basically go for text filter. I can say contains and let's go for something like United. And now you will see wherever your values are United States that shows up, but you can be more specific in saying I want the destination country. So I can basically say clear the filter. Let's go in here. Let's go for text filters. Let's say contains and let's say destination country equals and let's say United. Let's just search for this particular pattern and now you will see you have only the destination country being United States, right? So that basically allows you to filter out the data. For now I can clear the filter. So looks good. We have some useful data and this is your traffic related data what we have. So let's basically close and apply. And depending on the size of the data set, you can have it taking some time. So we could filter out, we could have said, okay, I'm not interested in anything which goes after or before August 19th, because this is, I think, data coming in from 2016, 2017, and we can choose the year. So, but let it get loaded. We can anyways do a transformation and we can check for information. But this is how you are basically creating data sets which has different fields. Now we can then change the data type as I explained. We can transform this data. We can basically relate these data sets and extract information out of it. We can create visualizations out of it. And let's see what is the size of this data. So it tells me we have, oh, that's a huge data set. Let's say, if you see, that's almost 4 gigabytes. So 88, yeah. So it's a 4 gigabytes data set. Might be we have to cancel this, and there are some pending changes, but let's reduce it. So what I'll do is I'll go for transformation and I'll do a transform. And we have these different filters, but let's go for the date field, which talks about something, and it tells me 2016, right? So we can select this, and what I can do is I can do a transform by year, and let's say I'm saying year doesn't look good. So that's only giving me how many values do I have? I have only 2016. So let's do a load more to see if there are many other values. Nothing specific. So let's go ahead and remove this. Okay, so I would be interested in, it's all August 8th, but then might be I can pick up a date which is going to reduce the data. So we have 8, 1, 2, how many entries we have? We have, say for example, 24th, and I know that there is some problem in 23 onwards. So let's choose from 820 onwards. So I'm going to unselect all, and then I'm going to say let's go for 820, 21, 22, 23, 24, 28, and anything before that. Well, let's take 29. Let's do a load more to check if we are missing on any dates. No. So let's go for select all. Right now you could go here and you can say date filters, and you can basically say the month or the day, right? So is not latest, you can choose is earliest, in the next, in the previous, before, after. So if I go for after, now it tells me you need to choose a particular date. So I could straight away say let's choose anything which goes after 819, right? And now you have 28. So that's basically selecting some data. So we can then also say if we want data for particular subset. So for example, let's choose this now. Let's say close and apply. It should substantially reduce the data. Now if you see here, since I'm doing a close and apply, it's trying to load both the data sets which we have, and that might again take time. So you have to choose, once you have transformed, if the data set which remains in your query editor, if that should be loaded when you are loading the other data sets. Sometimes if you're working on multiple data sets, that might be a bigger problem. So let's give it some time and we will check once the data is loaded. So both the data sets have been loaded now, and if you look into the FGT FortiGate event data, so that basically has my dates, and we can check that it has everything beyond 20 as we chose. And let's look at the traffic data. So if I look at the traffic data, now this one basically has dates which are even before 20. So it is trying to load the columns and it has all the dates. And what we will do is we'll try to sync the data and we will keep it beyond 820 like what we had in the previous data set. So let's have this one selected and let's go in here and I will say transform, and I will go for transforming the data again, which I forgot to do earlier. Or we can just reduce the data because the data sets might be huge, and once you have prepared your model and if you have a bigger system, then you can go for loading all the data. So we have the time and date field here, and then we have other fields which we are looking at, but this one basically has time which shows up everything. We can again merge this as date and time like what we have in our traffic data. So let's quickly check in traffic data. We have date and time. So let's go in here and we have the date and time. So let me just bring it here and then we can basically first merge them. So I have the date and time, but we are interested only in data which is after or from 20 onwards. So first let me basically apply a filter here. So we can go for date filter. I can say after, that's the easier way. Let's go in and select from 20, or let's say, let's go in here and this shows me 19. Let's choose 19 and let's go for okay. That should basically now give me only data which is 20 and beyond. And now let's select date and time and let's merge this with a space in between. So let's call separator as space and let's call it date. Let's say okay, and that's merged. So we have the time here, which is 11:58, and rest of the fields. So that looks good to me. And now let's do a close and apply. But remember, I'm working on event data, and traffic data was already loaded, and it is a bigger data set. So I can select this. I can say enable load again. So do a continue. And now let's select this where we really made the changes. Let's do a close and apply. And that's done because this was not a bigger data set. And now we can quickly check. So in the date fields, we are looking at the event data. So you have everything starting beyond 820. So anything before 820 is gone, and that's fine with us. And what we need is the traffic data also. So let's go back because that was not loaded, but we really need that. So let's go in home. Let's go to the transform. Let's choose this. It was not loaded. And let's enable load. So let's check. Yes, this is fine. And let's go ahead and basically close and apply. So now it's only going to get me the traffic data. So earlier we had the event data that was already loaded. So you can select data sets step by step and then load them. So in that case, it can be faster. You can reduce the time, how much it takes. Now, obviously, once you have filtered out all the data which you are interested in, and that is already loaded, then we can basically create a data model which can join these data sets based on device name, based on device ID, based on IPs, and we can create a link between these. So now that the data has been loaded for these two kind of sources, we can basically look into the fields what these have. So you have device ID, device name, destination IP, destination port, and similarly you have the events here which has device ID, device name. So we can basically get rid of some columns, or some columns we can keep them with the same naming conventions. So this one basically has a date.1 field which we can change, and here we have date. So let's look at this one, and I'm looking at the date field here which basically says date.1, which doesn't look good. So let's rename this. Let's call it date. And remember, this is a bigger file based on the time or the date or any other filtering criteria which we have chosen. So either you reduce the amount of date so that you can break it down and your processing can be faster, or when you would be using, say, Microsoft BI, that would be working on a powerful machine which could store it. Now, once this is done, what we also would want to do is we would want to work on loading one more data set. So this is firewall data, and I would be also interested in HTTP data, which also gives me information of the HTTP different methods, such as you have post, you have request, and so on. So we can do that. Now this date column looks good. You have type 1, type 2, type informations. You have device name, which says dev name, dev ID. So that looks good to me. And let's go in here. Let's look into this one. So we have dev name, dev ID. So those names are fine. You have your destination IP, destination port. You have the host name. You have the info. You have source and source type. So let's look at the traffic data. And this is where we have your source IPs, your source port, destination IP, which looks like a DNS server, and you have your host IP. So you can see what other information you have. So if I just scroll this, I have source and source type, which is showing up right here in the beginning. And if you compare this one, so this also has a source and source type, which basically uniquely identifies where the data is coming in from. And obviously we can arrange the columns in the way they look. The order of those we can merge and manage them. So this looks good. Now let's go in here. Let's go to get data. Let's go to Excel. Let's choose one more file, and I would be interested in HTTP. I can look into this refinement log, which looks like a 1 GB file. This one looks like a smaller 28 megabytes file. So let's take this one, and that's getting loaded here. We would want to transform this data. Okay, so let's get rid of serial. Let's filter that out. Now we can see there is this time field which is here, but we can split that out. So let the time be, let's not take this one, let's remove this. So stream, source, host, index we don't need. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of Splunk server. Now let's look at host information, and that basically gives me a similar kind of server name. So let's not even use this one. Now comes our raw field. If you double click on one of these, it shows me a lot of information here, and it is in the form of you have your data is separated by comma here. So we can basically choose comma as the delimiter, splitting the data, and then you can have consolidated information. So let's go ahead this one. Let's do a split column. Let's go by delimiter, and I'm going to choose comma, and let's say okay, and that basically shows me the column. So you have your end time, timestamp. Now these two can be merged, and we can replace the brackets, so that's fine. You have acknowledgement packets information, you have bytes, bytes in, bytes out, you have source IP, which is CIP, you have cached. So we can get rid of these, we can. So you see there are these number of columns. Now let's work on this. So first let's get this and this. So first let's replace this. So we have everything starting with end time. So let's go ahead and rename this to end time. That's done. Now just do a replace values. And what do you want to replace? So let's use this bracket. Let's say end time and colon. Now that one should be gone. So that looks better. We have the timestamp also. And if you carefully look at the timestamp here, so you have the timestamp which can be brought out from this one. Let's do a second level replace. And what I'll do is I'll choose anything starts with T. I can do a wildcard ending with Z. And let's try this. And it does not find this particular pattern. Okay, let's do it in a different way. So I can do a replace, and we can basically say T should be replaced with a space. So now you have T which is gone, and we basically have the date and time. So what we can do is, it will take a little bit of work here where you have to merge the date and time. So the easier way would be basically splitting this data based on a delimiter. So we have these timestamps embedded with the time. So what I can do is I can go ahead here and do a split column by delimiter. Now I know that there is a time delimiter T. So let me split by that. And now I have my time, which also shows that in a date time format. You have end time, which is also having a timestamp. So first is, let's clear this off. Let's get rid of this column. And now the end time, I can basically here again do a splitting of this by delimiter. And this time my delimiter will be a custom. And then let's choose a dot here. And let's split it based on the dot. So that gives me the timestamp, which is automatically formatted, which looks good. Although we have to take care if it is in hour or 12 hours or 24 hours format. So now we don't need this. We can get rid of this, and that's the simplest way. And then basically I can do a merge of this and this. Let's do a merging with a space as the delimiter. So let's call it space, and let's call it date, and let's do a merging. In simple way, we have the data here. Now the time and everything can be formatted, but that gives me some information. It tells me packets in, packets out, bytes, bytes, bytes in, bytes out. And we can basically club this information. So I can basically say your acknowledgement packets. So if you see here, you have acknowledgement packets in. So these are the only values which you have, and we can get rid of all these values which says except and except. So we are not interested in this. We are interested in acknowledgement packets in and out, and that looks good. So bytes, we can look at the filters, and it basically gives me all the bytes value. Let's keep that. So you have bytes in, bytes out. Now these we could have basically filtered out and given column names. So like we did earlier, so we can just do a rename, and let's say acknowledgement packets in. That's going to be my column name. And then let's just replace the values here, which is basically going to search for ACK underscore packet underscore in colon should be replaced or should be basically gone. So let's get rid of that. So it's still working on it. It might be huge data. And similarly, we can work on this one to do a replace, and let's call it acknowledge pack underscore out. Let's choose this column. Let's do a replace values, and we want acknowledge packet out colon should be replaced with space. So just the values there. And if we have given the fields right, then that should be fine. So let's get rid of this overall bytes. We would be more interested in looking at bytes in and bytes out. So let's go in here and let's rename this to bytes underscore in, and then basically replace the values, or you could keep that with a key value pair if that's what you would want to keep. So bytes in with a colon should be replaced. So that works fine. So this one is still taking time. Let's see. We did a replace and we said acknowledgement packets out. That was the pattern. Replace it with nothing. Yeah, so now it's working. And then you basically do a replace. You have to be careful with the case sensitiveness. And let's replace this. Oh, doesn't look good. So let me again do a replace, and I want the semicolon to be gone. Yeah, and bytes in, similarly, you have bytes out. So let's say bytes underscore out, and replace this bytes underscore out, and then you basically have your client IP, which shows up here. Now, do you want to go for caching? No. Do you want to go for capture host name? Not exactly. Client RTT, client packets, client sum. Let's get rid of these. So that's gone. So connection type, which basically has, you can always look at the values which says connection type close or keep alive, not interested. This version, not interested. So basically we can, if there is a lot of information which you might be using later, so you have some data packets in, data packets out, and let's see, we already had here bytes in, bytes out. Yeah, so let's go in here and let me do this thing. So before I work on the client IP, let me take this, take this, take this, all this information here, and let's basically merge these, and we can keep comma as separator, and let's call it info. So that's merged, and then you have data packets in and data packets out. So let's quickly rename this. So before doing that, just check the values here. So you have data center time. Now we have the time factor already, and it talks about data packets in and out, and that's basically in values or out values. So we don't need the data center values. So let's go ahead and basically get rid of this. So now the data has been transformed. I have basically replaced the client IPs and all the other data, which would be better if we keep as one. So this remains because this has embedded information and we don't want to lose any data. So it would be good to keep it here, and then we can do a content search on this. So this is the data which has been modified. Now I already had these data sets, so I can basically choose enable load. I will remove this. I will basically go for this one, which is enable load, and then I am only interested in this one. So let's do a save, close, and apply. So the changes have been made. Now these changes will be applied. Now if you see, my older data sets are already here, and I really did not want to go through the whole process of reloading them. So I have just worked on this stream HTTP data, and I am just loading this one. So this shouldn't take much time, and we should have the data loaded. Now once we have this, now similarly you can work on all the data sets. So I do have the source type, you have the dates, and if you closely see here, all the dates is basically beyond, and it's only 828. So I do have information, but here I am looking at the date field, and that basically shows me all the fields here. So looks like we have to filter out the date, because that can again be whose data. It tells me there is 21,758 rows. There are columns with these many distinct values. So it gives me this, but let's do a last level of filtering. So I am going to work on transforming this. So let's go in and transform this one again. And here you have the date, and we were interested only in 820 onwards. So let's make sure that this is the date we have. Okay, so the best option would be first basically splitting this. So let's go ahead for split this. by a particular delimiter, and here my delimiter will be space, and then we can re-merge the data. So this is being split date 1 and date 2. Now I can go here and it does show me only these dates, but let's make sure. So I'll say after, and we will look into, oh, I'm sorry. So what we are doing here is we are removing this. Let's not split this. This was actually fine because I was looking into the event data, which is fine. We have to focus on this one. So this is where my date has, it looks to me in a date string format, which is not good. So let's do a split by a delimiter, and let's say the delimiter be space, and let's say okay. So I know it will basically have these two, so it basically has split the data. And now what we will do is we will go in here. It shows me, yeah, so it shows me all the dates which we are not interested in. We are interested in only these dates. Well, I could have said after, and that would be an easier approach. Yeah, so this is fine. Now we have the dates. Now we have applied this filter. So let's take this column and this column again. Let's merge the columns. Let's have space as the delimiter. Let's call it date. And let's say, so we have all these values. Now this column, which was also extracted from here, could not be merged. So let me remove this. So we have to spend some time in doing this data wrangling stuff. And now let's do a close and apply only for this HTTP data. And now we only see the stream data set which is available here. First, let's confirm. So we have successfully transformed our three bigger data sets. One is HTTP related and two are traffic and events. Now this is how as of now, there is no relationship between them. If we would want to visualize the data which comes in from one source or joins with other source, we will have to create relationship between them. However, we can look at the fields and we can try to understand. So let's look into the data set quickly. Now, if we look into the event data, so we have our source type. We basically have the host. We also have the date and time, which is there in each of the data sets. So you have basically the date here, which we can see in traffic data. So we have the date, we have event that also has the date. However, the format is little different. And what we can do is we can basically look at the data. We can see that it is in a text format, and if we would want to change, we can do that. However, date is not the concern. The other fields have been transformed. So we look at total number of sessions, we look at the type of information, what kind of information we have, what is the kind of device ID. So this is what we are seeing in FGT event. Now in FGT traffic, I have my host name, I have the date, I have device name, device ID. And these device names and device IDs, if we look at the other one, that is FGT event, so these would be same. And then you have other information which is related to traffic here. So you look at the source IP, you look at the type of information, and then if you look in stream HTTP, you have packets in, packets out, bytes in, bytes out. So let's basically now create a visualization taking the information from all these three. Now we can either explicitly define relationship, or when we are creating the visualization, we can go ahead with the relationship. So let's go here and let me first choose your stream HTTP. So I have the client IP, I have the source and source type. So what I will do is I will basically say, for example, let's start with your FGT event and traffic data. So let's have a merger between these. So let's select event, and here let's select the date column. So let me bring the date here. Now that basically gives me the date and the time, and that basically looks fine. Now you also have your device ID. So let's bring the device ID, which shows me the device ID. Let's bring the device name. So this is the information I want. Now I can get the source so that I know where all the data is coming from. So let's take the source and drop it here. So that basically tells me the source. I also have the source type. So let's choose the source type, which tells me FGT event. And then we basically have, say, for example, type info. That is the field I have. So for example, let me select type 1, bring it here, and that tells me what is the kind of information I have. Either it is a count, or basically it's an action, which we can basically then create some filters to filter out the data. Let's look at type 2 info, and that basically gives me type 2 info, which is either talking about CPU or total count. So let me just get rid of type 2 info. That doesn't look so interesting. Let's look at type 3 info. And that basically gives me some total session and DHCP statistics. So we will just keep type 1 info here. And now I will choose the traffic, FGT traffic. And here I will choose the destination IP. So let's bring it here. Now when I do this, it says cannot display the visual. Fix this. Let's go ahead and fix this. It says, do you want to do a auto detection of the result? Let's do that. So it basically says there were no relationships which were detected. Let's go to manage relationships. And since there is huge data, it has to basically, you have to give the control to Power BI, fill up the fields. So it is basically showing me the from table name and to table name, and if we have some relationships which can be created. So I can click on new, and here let's choose FGT event, which basically has the host, device name, device type, and so on. And here let's choose FGT traffic. Now I have basically the device name, and that basically can be chosen, and device name can be chosen here. And I can say this shows as many to many relationship. And if you see that this relationship has cardinality many to many, this should only be used if it is expected that neither column, that is device name and device name, contains unique values. So if it has unique values, then you can go for one to many. So we can basically go ahead here and say 1 to 1, for example, but it says it is invalid. Let's go to 1 to many. And again, it says, so the only which is expected is many to many, and choose this. So it basically says there is a relationship established between device name and device name. I can also say new, again choose FGT, and here choose traffic. So we have device name also. So let's select this. Oh, device name is already done. So device ID, and then device ID here. And let's make this active. or I could have just said okay. So let's say okay. And now you have device ID and device name. Let's also see something else. So let's look at new, and I will choose event. So I have all this information, which is giving me the type of information what we have, total number of sessions, what is the performance statistics and all that. But then these might not have the same columns here. So what are the same columns we have? So we have traffic, we have source IP, we have source port, and then we have information which we would want to pull out. But let's basically go in here, and we can define a relationship between source IP, and here we have the host IP. So if we know that this is the host where we are looking at, so for example, if I choose host and if I choose source IP, now I can say okay. So these are some of the relationships I'm creating, and then I can, you can't create a direct active relationship between event traffic because an active set of indirect relationships already exist between these tables. To make this relationship active, set the cross filter direction to single, delete or deactivate any of the indirect relationships first. So we have direct and indirect relationships which we can choose. Now we have, if for example I remove this and then if I select this, so I'm saying let the host and the source IP be my relationship. Let's click on close, and now let's see, let the data get populated. So based on the columns which we have chosen, and now we are interested in the information here. So let's look at the model meanwhile. So you see the kind of relationships you have created. So there is basically your destination. So you have the star symbolizes many to many. So we basically have many to many relationship, and that basically depends on the column names which we have mapped. Now, if I go back here, and this is where I can be seeing. So let's go into traffic and let's drag and drop the type 1 info here. And we will have to give it some time because now it is trying to detect based on the device ID, device names. It is trying to match the value of your source, which we have chosen here, with the host information. And those values have to be same because that's the relationship we have made active. And then we will see the result because it has to basically filter out the host name here, and you have the source IP which we chose here. So let me go back to the relationships, and that's your device name, device name. This is your device ID, device ID. This is your source IP and host. Let's go back to visualization. So since we have established the relationship, I can select this, I can delete this, and I can go for visualization again. So let's now go ahead and start selecting, say for example, date field. Now I will choose the device ID. Let's go for device name, device name. Let's make this bigger. And then let's go for source. I would want to keep the source, so it tells me what is the source type, right? We can get rid of source for now. Source type is fine. And let's also go for host. So that basically gives me my host values, and we can, just to check, since we have linked our host with the source IP in the relationship, let's also choose destination IP, source IP, and finally your type info. Now this is basically huge data what we are looking at. So it is basically saying filters on these visuals which we can basically control. So here if you see, you can do a sorting, you can add some list. So right now we have added these filters and we will have to give it some time where it can populate. So meanwhile you can either do a show as table, you can go in here and then scroll down and you have data fields here, filters on the page which we can apply. Now let's go to the drill through. So let's go to the formatting and let's go to the grid, and you want to have vertical grid, so let's switch it to on. Let's make it black, and now I have basically your horizontal grid color, so let's create that also as black. Now we can go for font size, so let's increase that. That's your text size depending on your screen. And image height, that's fine. Now column headers, you can look at the font color, what's the background color. Text size, let's make it bigger, and then you have your values. So this is fine, and now you have your totals. If you have field formatting, so we can choose the date field which we have chosen, and we can choose this, which basically says, do you want to auto align it, or you want to change something, you want to give a title. So these are all the options which you can use for formatting. And let's go in here and let's go to the filter here. So remember, it is going for when you look at the filter, it is telling me these are the host IPs which it will be looking for. This is the source types it will be looking for. This is the source IPs which it is looking for. And we can either select one of the source IP depending on the count what we have here to filter out the data, or it's going to be trying to match all the entries here. Now we are looking at a bigger data set. So let me choose here a particular value. For example, there are 3 entries for this particular IP being the source IP. And we have type 1 info. We can see what kind of information it contains. It talks about traffic. Now that's what we wanted based on our host and source IPs. So this looks good. We just need to make sure that the host field was connected to source IP. So let's go in here and select, let's search for something. So there is a 250 entry here. Okay, we can come back to the visual. Let's go back to the table here and let's look at some data. So we are looking at FGT event. Let's look at the host value, which is 192.168.250.1. That's my host. And here, let's look at in traffic. Let's look at the source IPs, the source, and then you basically have the host, which has the same values. So host and source IP. So what we created as a relationship might be we have to basically check that. So now that using the relationship, what I also did was earlier we were creating multiple relationships, and that can also slow down the process. So what you can always do is you can go back here, and if you see, I have created a relationship between host to host because I know the values can be in sync or same across these. So if you would want to work on a relationship, you can just go ahead and delete this, and that's basically gone. So your relationship is gone, and now your visual report, if you go back, will show that there is some error because there is no relationship established. Now let's look at the fields again. So we have this particular information which is saying that we have our data set. So let's look into the stream HTTP data set. Now this is where we have basically packets in, packets out. So we have the source and source type, which basically are giving us the same information. So we can choose one of these in HTTP. And then you also have your date, you have packets in, packets out, bytes in. So you have total bytes. Now this is what we can focus on, or we can be looking at what is the total number of bytes, bytes in, bytes out. So this is the information coming from HTTP. Now again, you have the client IP here. So your client IP has 192.168.250.100. So basically let's try to match that here. Now when you look at the HTTP traffic, and if you look at destination IP, now that's the basically server. So you can always see what are the kind of values you have. So you have different values here. And this is where the connections have gone. You have your source IP, which is basically showing up different values again. So you have different source IPs, you have different destination IPs, and you have the host name, which is 251. That's your only host name in this one in the traffic. Now if we look at type 1 info, then we are looking at these columns. Now since the data is huge, you don't see these other columns, but then we can obviously refresh and we can see if these columns are showing up. So you have more number of columns which are here which will be used. So you have source IP, you have destination IP, and so on. And if we look at the information from your FGT event, you basically have your source, you have your host. So let's take host device ID from here. Now we have the level. Let's see how many values you have. So you have alert, information, notice, warning. So we can then filter out only warning messages if we are interested in. So I could be just saying warning. So we can choose level from here. We have your log description, which talks about kind of statistics. What is the info? So is it performance statistics? And then you have your CPU total sessions. So now, for example, let's go to visual. And if I would have to create a relationship, I will have to choose different fields. Now, the only one thing which we need to understand is in stream HTTP, you have your client IP. Now let's look at those values here. Stream HTTP, which basically has your client IP. Let's look at the source. And also we can work on the date field here. So this is in AM or PM, what values we are seeing. And let's have the date field in FGT event. That's also showing AM or PM. So let's first create a relationship between SGT and stream HTTP. And what we can do is FGT. Let's keep it here. Let's bring it here. So what I can do is I can have from stream HTTP a relationship with the date here. So there can be date. Now there are these formats which we can change if that is giving a problem. Let's say okay. However, it is advisable. Let me just delete this. Let's go back here. Okay. So we want information from all these three data sets, and we do not want to really go with the join condition. We basically want to join them either on the date field or basically your other fields which have common values. So since there were many relationships created, and then we had to look into the fields which had date time format in a different way, what I did was I did some cleanup. I removed the relationships as of now, and I reloaded the data. So just let's look and understand that. So this one, starting from our three different data sets. First, let's look into the FGT event. By clicking on this, now it shows me source type. It shows me the host, that is from where the request is originating. It shows me the date. Look at that format here. And then you have device name, device ID, what is the type of message, and then you have some log information based on which we can filter out or pull out some specific information. Now what we notice here is host name is 250.1, and we have only one host field, so that's perfectly fine. Now let's look into the other data set, that's FGT traffic, which will give me some traffic information. Now here again, if you look at the second column, the host is 251, which basically means I can create a relationship between FGT, FGT event, and FGT traffic based on host field. Now notice the date format has also been changed. We have device name, device IDs, so that also should be the same values. And you have the type info, so you can look into what kind of information you have, and this is traffic information. It looks at the subtype, and that tells me either it is forward or local, on which we can create filters. Now you have the traffic going to the source IP, and you have the source port. So source IP basically has different fields, and we will see what is the source IP. So you have a host, and then you have source IP from which the connection would be going to, say, destination IP. So you have destination IP which have multiple fields, and then obviously you have info, wherein you can say, for example, select one of the fields, or just place your cursor here, and it tells you what kind of information it has. It has an action, it has policy ID, it has destination country, source country, and everything is separated by comma. So if you would want, you can split this complete information into comma into different fields. So that's your second data set. And the third data set is your stream HTTP, which basically has your source type. It has the date, again format converted, packets in, packets out. And here you have client IP, which is basically showing, let's look at the values, and it has various values. Now the source IP in the previous data set and the client IP here from where the request is originating would be the same one. And then obviously you have the information. So now we can create a visualization using these. So we have the model here. Now what I can do is I can start creating relationships between this one. So here I have host, and I can have host connected to host here. So basically this has, now what does it say? This should only be used if it is expected that both the columns do not have unique values. But we know that there is unique value, which is 192.168.250.1. So if I say 1 to 1, it basically says the cardinality you selected isn't valid for this relationship. If I basically go for apply security filter in both the directions, it does not still work. And you can look at the cross filter which says single, so you can have a relationship between this and this. So you can say, but the thing here is there are various combinations for these particular values, and that's why it is saying this cardinality does not work. So let's go for many to many. That's fine. and let's go for OK. So you should have a relationship now between host and your host. Now what we can also do is we can go for device name or device ID. So I can again create one more between device name and device ID. In case there are different values, I can say OK. So this is one more relationship I'm creating between these, although I am not making this active. So we can see when we look at the star, it tells me that it is many to many. Now what we can also do is, as I explained, so you have your FGT traffic, which basically has your source IP, and here you have client IP. So let's create a relationship between client IP and source IP, and let's go for OK. So that's again a relationship between these. Now these relationships should be enough for me to pull out the information from all these three data sets, which can be related on the same date or which could be based on the values. So we do have date. What I have done is I have filtered out the date as I explained earlier, which was 20 onwards, 820 onwards. But then I have changed that to make the data set a little smaller, and I have chosen anything beyond 823 and then up to 828. So now this is done. Let's go to visualization and let's pull out the information. So let's say it is talking about a previous field which we have. Let's close this. So I can say fix this, and here I can close this one. So we don't have any data fields right now. So now let's start selecting. So let's first go to FGT event. I will be interested in the date field, and let's get the date. Now it is broken down into your year, quarter, month, and day. Now we can change that format. So here we have your date field, which is basically being broken down. Now I can just say date, and I don't want the date hierarchy. So date is fine, which gives me the time. You see the starting time is 23 onwards. Now what we are interested in is basically the device name. So we have created a relationship, and it is good to choose the fields on which you have created the relationship. Now we have the host field. So let's select that. Now there is one entry for that, and that shows me the host field. You have level, which had two values. So let's select level. Now you can always check here when you are looking at these particular fields. You can check here, which will tell me what are the different values. And if you want only a selected value, say for example we want warning information or basically alert information, which is a lesser number, I can select that, or I can add that as a filter. So I can do that. So let's, for example, choose this level. So that's done. Now let's go to the traffic field. So we have date, we have device ID, we have device name, which we have already taken. So there is no point in taking device name again. We can look at the destination IP. So that's available from this data set. Let's take the destination IP. Now host is something which we have already created a relationship. We have info, we have source type, we have source IP. So let me go for source IP from here, and I'm adding source IP. Now I have the info field, which basically has the overall text, which has useful information which we can pull out. So we have chosen the destination IP, we have chosen the source IP, which we can do a count on, and then basically we have, say, type 1 info, which basically has some specific field. So let's try adding this, and we can see what kind of data it contains, and that might be a larger field, so it might take sometimes time, but then that's okay. And that's your traffic, that's your event, and now we have our HTTP data. So this one basically has your client IP, which would be same as host IP, as I mentioned earlier. So let's select client IP. It got selected twice, that's fine. And then you have your info as the column. You have bytes in, bytes out. You have acknowledged packets in, packets out. And you basically have your source type. So we can select source type just to keep in track of the data is coming in from which source. But as of now, I can just choose bytes in, which might be interesting field to look at if there are bytes coming in, and then you look at bytes out. So let's for now cancel this type 1 info, and this is the data which we are creating the visualization. Now, as I said, when you are selecting these particular fields, it is going to look for the host IP. It is going to look at my destination IP. Now we can always go back to the data set and check if what appears in host IP, does that appear in, say, source IP or client IP in a particular data set. So for example, if I go in here, and if you see, I have client IP, which is basically 192, 168, 250, 100. That's what I have filtered for in this particular stream HTTP dataset. So if you go back to client IP, that's the value which is showing up. And if you look in FGT traffic, so here we have our host, or we basically have our destination IP or source IP. So let's look at the source IP, and here I can search for the IP which we see as client IP. So let's see 192, 168, 250, and then let's search for 100, and that shows me that there are entries for this. So it basically is correct, where we have created a relationship between source IP and client IP. We have pulled out this information. Now let's go back to the visualization. It is still working on it based on the data what we have. Now what we can do is the level which we were seeing here. So level, which basically had 4 values, and we see there is a least count of alert. So let's choose this, and that should basically faster or make my query faster, because now I am selecting for your filtering and I'm saying level is alert. So it has to not look at all the information, but it has to pull out level being alert. And if you see, we already have these entries, which basically tells me host IP, and then you have source IP, and then you have client IP, which is same. So source IP and client IP are same. What was the bytes in, what was the bytes out, right? And now you have the alert level. So this was the alert where we were saying we also look at the destination IP, and it pretty much looks the same except the one which we see here. So this one where we are looking at the information on 23rd August, it tells me alert where host is 251. You have source IP, which is basically 2.50. We have client IP, which is matching. And then you basically have a destination IP, wherein bytes in is 0 and bytes out is huge. And this is something which we can look at to see if there is any problem with that. So this is a simple report which we have created, and what we have is we have these different levels what we are seeing. I mean, we have chosen alert as the level. Now what I could do is I can add a filter, so, or slicer. So it says the entities that columns in the values bucket belong to are not hierarchically related, because then we can look at the details here. So it says value bucket are not, so we can send something, or for example, we can get rid of the filter as of now. Let's just go to the table, and we can basically say, okay, this is my level field. So we have selected just this particular data, but what we would be interested in is not information, but might be notice or warning messages. So let's also select warning. And then obviously we can do a count. We can find out on this information what we are pulling out. So I would want to look at my alert and warning messages when your source IP and client IP was same. Request was originating from host, and we are looking at bytes in, bytes out. But I can now look at specific other information. So if you go back here and if you look into your data set, so we have basically our data set which shows the source IP, because there that was the filter which has been applied. Now I can basically go ahead and say clear filter here, and that shows me all the entries. It shows me what is the action which says accept or information. So we can do a text filtering here where we can be looking at different values. So let's see what kind of values we have here. And if you carefully see, it tells me that there is this destination country which is Canada, and your destination country is Hong Kong, source country is something else. So we can be looking for a particular country. We can be looking at, if you look at the DNS apps, what is the app here? Is it a DNS? Is it a NetBIOS? Is it something else? What kind of risk we are talking about? Is it an elevated risk? Are we talking about duration? So we can filter out this information to reduce our results, because as of now we have everything. So say for example, I have my destination country as Netherlands. So let's go ahead here and I will basically say, let's go for a filter, and let's say text filter, let's say contains, and now let's say I'm interested only in Netherlands data. So let's say okay. So the filter is applied, and now what you're looking at is just the Netherlands data for your particular data set. Come back to your visualization. So we see the information getting populated here, and we have alert. We should have the warning messages also as we have chosen. So we are seeing alert as of now as the level, and we look at a lot of destination IPs. Now similarly, what I can be doing is I have this information, I'm looking at the level which is alert. Now as I said, we can be choosing warning like we chose earlier. Now what we can also do is we can pull out the information which is based on the total bytes if we would want to see. So let's basically bring total bytes field, and that should get added to your visual. And now you see you have the total bytes values which are showing up for all your entries here. Now that's my simple report which we have created based on the fields. We can be just looking for your source IP and client IP being same. So we have chosen host because we were interested in getting the data from our respective data sets. That's your FGT event, which basically has some log info. So now I would be interested in getting the bytes in or bytes out. So let's get rid of bytes in. That's not what I'm concerned about. I would be interested in looking at the log info, which is basically a consolidation. What we can also do is we already know what is the destination, what is the source IP, what is the client IP which we are looking at, and we know that source IP and client IP will be matched. So let's reduce the burden by getting rid of your client IP here. Now if you see, we are already seeing some information which has come in here, which talks about your log info, which talks about configuration was changed, who was the user, what was the IP, and we are basically filtering out the information. I'm still seeing the source IP. I'm looking at the client IP. I'm looking at the values where they are basically matching. So you look at the new data, which is host name, you have alerts, you basically have your destination IP, source IP. So we can always see what is the destination IP, what is the source IP. Source IP is same as your client IP. Remember the bytes in, byte out information, what we are extracting is coming in from your stream HTTP data. And these are, if you just look at the message, it clearly tells me that this is an alert message. And that's why we are seeing configuration changed. Now that's the kind of information we are seeing. And there was an alert generated, which was coming in from source and on that particular destination server. So this was, and there was some bytes in, bytes out going, and you can look at the total number of bytes, which is a total of bytes in and bytes out. So you can also calculate what was the bytes in, if there was some kind of acknowledgement which was sent. And this is good information. So we can get rid of alert and let me say just warning. So I would want to select warning. Now we are talking about count of 400, and we will have to give some time, and then we can start saving this or publishing this report. What we can also do is, once we have published the report, we can ask questions to this one, right? So it will always be good to publish the report with all the levels rather than a particular level, because then it gives you a wide variety of asking different questions, different kind of log information messages, what we are seeing at. So date can be important. Device name, what we are looking at, can tell me where the data is coming in from. So technically speaking, we have bytes in, bytes out. That's the kind of message which we are seeing. And we are seeing what is the device name. Now device name is basically coming in from this particular event field, and that's why it is showing up the values. Here we don't have any device name, so we can keep the device name or we can filter it out. So we know that there is a relationship between host of your FortiGate event and FortiGate traffic, and that's good enough. Now I have taken up this example which looks complex, but then it's very useful in real-time machine data, where you can create visualization, where you can work on multiple data sets, where you can do data modeling, which basically means that you can have relationships between different data sets so that you can create your visualization, you can create your reports, and then basically you can save or publish those reports. So once this report is generated based on these simple data sets, we can continuously improve our data modeling. So right now we just have this information, but what I can do is I can go for the modeling option here, and then I can basically mark as date table. I can manage the relationships here. I can go in for a new table, new measure. So remember, measure is something which you can create here. So these are your dimensions or values coming in from dimension tables. So new measure is basically if you would want to calculate something. If you would want to calculate something. So for example, you want to calculate how many different destination IPs are existing, or if you would want to go for a quick measure, so choose from a list of common calculations and add the results to the selected table. So we can do that. So for example, let's go for quick measure, and it says, okay, what is the calculation you would want? So it says you can get a average per category, variance per category. You can basically do a count. You can get max. So max and minimum would not work. Might be we can work on bytes data. So we can do that. We can say basically your quarter to date total, month to date total. So you can just go for total for category. So filters applied, and you can basically go for cat totals. You can do some mathematical operations if you are interested in. You can concatenate list of values. So for example, we can go for total for category. Now calculate the total across all values in a category applying filters in your report. So we can basically say what is the data field you would want to work on. So for example, let's say the destination IP. So let me add that here. Now this one is category over which do you want to calculate the total. So I have destination IP, and let's say source IP or client IP. So that's the category, and I'll say okay. Now this is where you are doing a quick measure where there are list of measures which we can add. So measures, if you remember, dimension tables are something which contains the actual data, and your measures are basically what is stored in the fact table, right? So fact table has fields or columns which are already in your dimension table. So your dimension table has the columns as the primary key, and facts table has the columns as the foreign key. Plus your facts table will have measures, and basically those measures is what you're trying to calculate, which can be added to your table that is as your report, and then you can publish the report. So this is where we chose a quick measure. We are doing it. Now I can add a new column, I can create a new measure depending on the value. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to say, let's find out the count of your source IPs, and the category which I'm choosing is destination IPs. So I would want to get a count of what are the different source IPs, what are the counts of those, and then we can basically tabulate that. So let this report run, and we will have a view at it, and we will then publish this. So now if you look at this messages, so we are looking at our report, might be quite big in a format. So I can basically choose the format by going in here, and we have the general and background, and let's look into general. So it basically gives all text. We can give some details here, but let's look at the grid. So first it is still working, so sometimes you have to wait. So for example, I choose and then I look into the value. So I can go into the style and I can change the formatting. So the report which we are running is on huge data set. And that's something which we need to remember to basically look at the result or to look at the count of whatever we are doing. It might take some time. But then once it is done, we can easily publish this. So after sorting the data and reducing the data, because data was really huge, so it was taking time to generate the report and publish it. So basically here the report has been created. Now we can apply measures to this. If you closely see here, I have applied filters, which is alert, which basically tells me just 12 alerts because we have run a quick measure. So I am looking only for alert level information, and date I have chosen everything beyond 27,754, because what I know is that in my traffic related data, so if you would basically see here in the traffic related data, so we have date which has been filtered, and if I look into my other data such as HTTP, I can see the date which exists here shows 26 because now we have filtered the data. So you have to filter the data, otherwise you might fall short of memory. Now here, if you see, the data starts from 28, 23, 51, and then that's the last one. So you can obviously see in a reverse order, or you can sort this by doing this, and that should show you the starting data. And here, if I closely see, there are all the fields which are showing up, but then you can basically choose how much data you are pushing in there. So the data here is basically having huge amount of data, and that will affect your visualization. So you have to be careful in what data you select and how much would go into your visualization. So in my visualization, based on the fields which we have selected, I have basically limited the amount of data which can show me in the report. However, when we have a bigger server, we can basically create a report with all the data, or the suggestion would be to break the data sets into smaller chunks and then go for reports and visualization. Now, this report was published to my BI service. And if you see here, this is my BI service, which has the data. I have applied the similar kind of filters here, and now I can start asking questions, which can then be added to my report. So here I'm saying, show me the first total of this CP total from your source IP. So I can look into something like this. Now, if I'm not interested in this, I can delete this. I can ask different questions here. So for example, count, I can say count destination IPs, and that tells me there are different 13.44 destination IPs. And I can say for each source IP, that is source IP or the client IP. Now you can give a query like this, which will basically try to do a count of destination IPs for your source IPs, and it can give you a count. So here it gives me what is the destination IP for each source IP, and this one has the highest count. And then you can look at the other values. And if you would want to save this question or the answer to this question, let's put it here. So we can basically make our report layout a little smaller or change the format here so that we can push in more data here or ask more questions. Now, once this is done, I have my report created with different kind of filters. I can just go ahead and save this report. Remember, I have filtered out the data and I have selected the data fields with date being just for 2 days instead of for 2 years. Now that basically affects my overall data. But what we have seen here is we are looking at our report. Now what we can do is we can look for other information here. So we have the visuals on the canvas. We can duplicate this, we can share this, we can look at the view and we can change this. We have the file and we basically have our reports which is shared. Now if I go back to my workspace, that shows me the dashboards which I have. I have some reports. Now this is the report here, and this is basically you can look at the usage metrics, you can share the information, you can get some quick insights, which Power BI is very powerful in looking at your data and gathering some insights. However, again, remember the amount of data which is selected will affect the time consumed in generating these insights. So while this is running, I can go back to my Power BI desktop and I can basically have a look at this. I can look at the data models. Now, these were the relationships which we created. So if you see, this was basically host and host. This was device name and device name. And here I had the client IP and the source IP. And this was basically my data model. Now I could have a facts table separately created, which has these some of the columns and then the measures which we can calculate and then add it to our facts table. Now this is basically a simple example of data modeling. You can play around with the data. As I mentioned, you can obviously go to Power BI, and if you would want to look at this data, as I mentioned earlier, you can just search for bot SV1 dataset. Generally, these datasets are used for threat hunting, but then this has a lot of data sets with different sources, and you can get the data from here. You can trim it and then you can basically use for your Power BI. Or you can always find data sets, and you can look into Kaggle or other sources where you can get different kind of data which can be used. Now if you see here, it basically gives me some insights, and we can choose which insights we would be interested in. So it says count of the source ports, and basically it gives me that these IPs, or which I know these are DNS servers, have noticeably more source ports. It gives me count of total bytes and count of bytes, so this is a correlation between total bytes and bytes. It gives me count of info, so what kind of information we have on packets in. So it says that there is a lot of information with packets in being 3. Now I can scroll down, I can see count of source report and count of info. So you can basically look at count of total bytes, count of info. So Power BI has generated all these insights for us, and we have this information now. I can obviously download this. So I can basically go in here and look at this particular insight. I can open it in a focused mode and look for more information, and we can choose what we would want to do with this insights. So if you see here, it gives me, when you look at the info, what kind of messages are more. That also gives you information, total bytes, count of your destination IPs, and I can basically click on this one. It opens up in a bigger window. It tells me this is count of dist IPs, or sorry, destination IPs based on your source IPs, and this is a great insight. So you can always look into the insight and then basically continue working on this. So I can just do a exit focus mode. I'm back to my insight. I can go back to my workspace. I can look into the reports. Now remember, when you publish your report comes in here, and that basically gives you an option to create a report. You can schedule it to refresh and get the newer data. You can basically view related information of this, and so on. So this is how you can use modeling with Power BI, and this is a simple example. Well, we can have more complicated modeling scenarios, and we can look at different data sets.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.